Reading and listening to stories is an amazing way to improve your English. So I've created 5 very short and interesting stories, and I want you to read and listen at the same time. And if you want to improve your pronunciation, you can even shadow and try to imitate my pronunciation. Story number 1. My first attempt at cooking for friends. Last Saturday, I made the questionable decision to invite a few friends over for dinner. Normally, I'd just order a takeaway and pretend I'd cooked it myself. But this time, I thought I'd push the boat out and make something from scratch. I'd watched a couple of cooking videos, and they made everything look ridiculously easy. Chop an onion, throw in some garlic, stir a few things together. What could possibly go wrong? Well, quite a lot, as it turned out. The first problem came when I realized I'd bought double cream instead of coconut milk. Then I discovered I'd forgotten to buy rice altogether. I briefly considered driving back to the supermarket, but I'd already opened a bottle of wine, so that idea was quickly ruled out. By the time everyone arrived, the kitchen looked like a crime scene. There were dirty pans everywhere, vegetables scattered across the worktop, and smoke slowly drifting out of the oven. To make matters worse, one of my friends walked in and cheerfully said, "Smells interesting." That's never a good sign. I somehow managed to serve everyone a meal, although it looked nothing like the picture online. The sauce was far too thick, the chicken was slightly overcooked, and I accidentally added enough chili to make everyone's eyes water. Oddly enough, everyone still ate it. In fact, the whole evening turned into one long joke about my cooking skills. Every time someone took another bite, they'd dramatically reach for their drink as if they were about to breathe fire. By dessert, nobody cared what the food had tasted like. We were too busy laughing about the disaster. Looking back, I realized people don't really remember whether the food was perfect. They remember whether they had a good time. Next time, though, I'm definitely ordering a takeaway. Story number 2. The worst haircut of my life. A few years ago, I decided to save some money by going to a cheap barber I'd never visited before. That should have been my first warning. The place looked perfectly normal, although it was strangely quiet. There wasn't any music playing, nobody was chatting, and the barber barely said a word to me apart from asking, "Number 2?" I nodded. About 5 minutes later, I started to panic. Huge chunks of hair were falling onto the floor, and every time I looked in the mirror, my hair seemed to be getting shorter and shorter. Eventually, the barber spun the chair around with a huge smile on his face. "What do you think?" I genuinely didn't know what to say. One side was noticeably shorter than the other. My fringe had almost disappeared, and somehow my head looked twice as round as it normally does. I politely thanked him, paid, and walked out, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. For the next 2 weeks, I wore a cap everywhere, even indoors. Whenever someone asked why, I'd casually say I was having a bad hair day. That was technically true. My friends, of course, found the whole thing hilarious. One of them said I looked like I'd lost a fight with a lawnmower. Another asked if I'd cut it myself using kitchen scissors. The worst part was that I couldn't even be annoyed with the barber. He seemed genuinely proud of his work. Eventually, my hair grew back and life returned to normal. But ever since then, whenever I find a barber I like, I refuse to change. Some risks simply aren't worth taking. Story number 3. Missing the train. I'm normally quite organized, but every now and then I have one of those days where absolutely nothing goes according to plan. It all started when I overslept. I jumped out of bed, got dressed in record time, grabbed my bag, and sprinted towards the station. As I turned the corner, I could already see my train waiting at the platform. Perfect. Or so I thought. Just as I reached the doors, they closed right in front of me. I stood there completely out of breath while the train slowly pulled away. To make things even more frustrating, the driver actually looked at me as he left. I'm convinced he smiled. The next train wasn't for another 40 minutes. There wasn't much I could do, so I bought an overpriced coffee and sat on the platform watching people rush past. That's when things became even stranger. A pigeon landed on my bench and stared at me for what felt like several minutes. Then it casually walked over, stole half my croissant, and flew away. Nobody else seemed remotely surprised. By the time the next train arrived, I'd accepted that this simply wasn't my day. Ironically, when I finally reached my destination, the meeting had been delayed by nearly an hour because someone else had missed their train too. All that stress for absolutely nothing. Sometimes life has a funny way of reminding you that there's no point worrying about things you can't control. Story number 4. Looking after my friend's dog. When my friend asked if I could look after his dog for the weekend, I immediately said yes. How hard could it be? The answer, it turns out, was very. The dog looked incredibly calm when my friend left. That lasted about 30 seconds. The moment the front door closed, he grabbed one of my shoes and sprinted into the garden. After finally getting it back, I thought we'd settled down. We hadn't. Within the next hour, he'd stolen a sandwich, knocked over a plant, chased a squirrel, barked at the postman, and somehow managed to get muddy paw prints all over my sofa. Despite all that, he somehow looked completely innocent every single time I caught him. The real challenge came during our walk. Every few meters, he'd suddenly stop, refuse to move, and stare intensely at absolutely nothing. Then, without any warning, he'd take off at full speed, dragging me behind him. I'm fairly sure several people thought I was the pet. By Sunday evening, I was exhausted. My friend came home and cheerfully asked, "Was he well behaved?" The dog immediately sat down quietly beside him, wagged his tail, and looked like the most polite animal in the world. I couldn't believe it. It was as if he'd spent the entire weekend deliberately making me look ridiculous. Even so, I'd happily look after him again, just maybe after a long holiday. Story number 5. The day I lost my wallet. A few months ago, I had one of those moments that instantly makes your heart sink. I reached into my pocket to pay for a coffee. My wallet wasn't there. At first, I stayed calm. It'll be in my other pocket, I thought. It wasn't. I checked every pocket 3 times. emptied my backpack onto the cafe table, and even looked inside my jacket, despite not wearing it. Nothing. My mind immediately started imagining the worst. I'd have to cancel all my bank cards, replace my driving license, order a new ID card. It was going to be a nightmare. I retraced my steps through the town, asking in every shop whether anyone had handed in a wallet. No luck. About 2 hours later, I finally gave up and went home feeling thoroughly fed up. The moment I walked through the front door, I heard my phone ringing. It was the cafe. Someone had found my wallet underneath the chair where I'd been sitting the whole time. Everything was still inside. I couldn't believe it. When I went back to collect it, the waiter smiled and said, "You're not the first person today." Apparently, losing wallets on a Friday afternoon is surprisingly common. I bought another coffee to celebrate, although this time I made absolutely sure my wallet was safely back in my pocket before leaving. Some lessons only need to be learned once. There you go, guys. 5 very short stories that I hope you enjoyed and learned something from. If you like this kind of video, let me know in the comments. And as always, if you'd like to join my classes or download my app, there is a link in the video description. Thank you, and see you next time. Bye-bye.